And I just was so overwhelmed. I had individuals around me not wanting me to have this child. I didn't feel like I had anyone to go to. And she said, it's going to be okay. They gave me the confidence and the support that I needed. Looking back, I don't know what I would do without him, because I needed him. I needed him more than I think he needed me.
You're live.
Dr. Mohler, you're live.
Thank you. Welcome to this first World Opinions conversation. We are thrilled you've joined us, and I'm very glad to be joined by the panelists today. We are coming together for this conversation because of the 2022 midterm elections in the United States. And as a matter of Christian interest and of Christian thinking, we really want to put our heads together to try to figure this out. Our job at World Opinions is to bring to our readers and to the world family first-rate commentary, thinking, and analysis from a Christian perspective, and to bring Christian voices to so many of these issues. There's been plenty of conversation about the 2022 election, no doubt about that. The big issue is, what should we be thinking about? How should we be framing our thinking about the election? And how do we rightly talk about this with others, from members of our own family to members of our own churches and neighbors and in the larger community? I'm very glad to be joined today by Hunter Baker, world columnist, and he is also professor of political science and dean at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. So Hunter, welcome. We're also glad to have Allie Beth Stuckey, who is a world columnist also. She's the host of the Reliable podcast and a very well-known author. We are glad to have Erick Erickson, who's another world columnist, and he is also, of course, a political commentator and radio host on WSB Radio in Atlanta. And I'm incredibly glad to be joined by our managing editor for World Opinions, Andrew Walker, who is also professor of Christian ethics here at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. I'm Albert Mohler, your host, editor of World Opinions, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and, well, the one who's responsible to get this thing started. And so I simply want to turn to each of our panelists, and I want to ask you straightforwardly, what is the meaning of the election thus far? What do we know thus far? And Allie Beth, I'll ask you to go first. What do the 2022 elections mean?
Oh, there are so many lessons I think that we can learn from it. I think there are reasons to be sad and reasons to be happy as Christian conservatives. Obviously, the pro-life measures, both for and against abortion, in 6 states in the United States that did not go the way that pro-lifers want them to go. Of course, we are against a machine that is funded by millions and millions of dollars. So there's some difficulty there. But of course, there's reason to be disappointed and discouraged. But I also think there is a reason to be happy, specifically if you look at a lot of local races. Yes, there are national races that we won, but local races, many conservatives won their school board races. And I think that seems to be a little bit of a change, something that has mobilized over the past couple of years. And I'm really optimistic about what that can do for our school system and what that can do for our local communities.
Well, Allie Beth, I really appreciate you thinking about that and sharing that from your perspective. What did you say about the election before the election that that really frames this for you?
Yes. So I wasn't someone who predicted that it was going to be whatever you call it, a red wave or a red tsunami. I was hoping that we would have some more surprises from the conservative side than we did. But I also didn't share the deep depression that a lot of people did the day after. Number one, of course, because Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, Hebrews 13:8. And so that is where my hope rests and my joy rests. But
Amen.
also, there are a lot of things, a lot of wins to be happy about. Of course, the transformation of the state of Florida by Ron DeSantis, by leading on what is often called the culture war issues. I
Yeah.
think that shows where a lot of Americans are in their priorities. I knew that was going to be the case, and that shaped up to be the case. And so I can't say that I was too surprised by anything that happened on Tuesday.
Erick, what about you? You talk politics all the time, and lots of folks listen to what you have to say. So what about the election? What does it mean?
I say it's like Schrodinger's cat, it's Schrodinger's wave election. If you look at it, there was not one. If you don't look at it, there was. Republicans actually picked up seats in deep blue New York along Long Island. They wiped out the Democrats. They got Florida, of course. They had a blowout in Iowa. They got the Iowa Attorney General's race for the first time in 40 years. They've got a supermajority now in the North Carolina State Senate and one vote shy in the State House, picked up their Supreme Court in North Carolina and Nevada. They did quite well locally around Nevada. If you look at it, though, it looks like it was a very indecisive, muddied election, and candidate quality certainly mattered. And also, if you look at the exit polling, which is fairly precise these days, independent voters said they'd rather go through these uncharted times with the Democrats who they know than the Republicans they're concerned about, which is an easy fix for the GOP more than it is culturally for the Democrats, who are very much locked in now to a progressive ideology the voters said last night at 70% they do not like.
Yeah. So what's your biggest surprise?
My big surprise actually is that this wave crested in ways we didn't expect. I knew candidates mattered greatly, but to see Michigan, for example, flip so far to the left after what it went through under Gretchen Whitmer's policies last year, kind of disappointing for the GOP. At the same time, the Republicans who are elected are the most diverse crop of Republicans ever. Asian, Hispanic, and African American voters have started making decisive shifts towards the GOP as well.
Yeah, I'll simply say my biggest surprise as a native Floridian is Palm Beach County.
Yes.
In the gubernatorial race there in Florida. If you had told me just a few years ago that Palm Beach County would go decisively, in this case, very clearly, for a Republican and a conservative Republican like Ron DeSantis, that would have been almost unimaginable.
56% of the Hispanic vote in Florida went for his Ron DeSantis, only a third last time.
Yeah. All right, Hunter, what about it?
Well, I'm going to say something a little bit different. First of all, I want to say that we are on day two. We are finishing the second day after the election, and we're still counting votes. And actually, I'm involved with an organization that works on political depolarization, and we brought voters together to talk about confidence in the system, which is a really big issue right now. And unanimously, the people who participated, we call them reds and blues, unanimously, they all said, we want all the votes counted on election day. The fact that we're sitting here, 48 hours after everything is shut down, and we still don't know really in a decisive way at all. I mean, we're still waiting on significant matters, undermines people's confidence. It, regardless of whether the whole election denial sort of narrative is true, it doesn't help Americans feel good about the process that basically decides how things are going to go in this country to be waiting like this.
Yeah, Hunter, I appreciate that. If we just stipulate for a moment, let's just, for the sake of argument, let's say we don't have any doubts about the integrity of the electoral system. Let's just stipulate that for a moment, for argument. It certainly doesn't help when you have people say, we just, we're reminded of 52,000 votes, or there are more votes coming in from here and there in terms of remote voting. It just doesn't help. And these are political choices. And I try to remind people that we should be thankful we don't have a national electoral system. I mean, that I'm a federalist. I believe in the authority of the states to conduct these elections. And so I don't, you talk about the opportunity for mischief, you centralize it all in a federal authority. That just makes it all the more dangerous. But, these states have made decisions, and the decisions made by states like Pennsylvania, that they're not even going to work on these ballots until the polls open on election day. And then they're going to go through a process. And look, much of that process makes sense, but it sows seeds of suspicion that after the votes are cast, folks are going to manipulate it. And it just reminds me of the fact that Robert Caro, in his magisterial biography of Lyndon Johnson, reminds us that in one of his Senate races, they did keep the phones open until they had as many votes as they needed. That's not something that's contestable now in terms of American history, nor do I mean to sow seeds of doubt. It's just that the fact that election day is a very important thing. If the state of Florida can have votes, it's just a reminder, with all its population, it's a reminder that it is not impossible to have votes on election day.
Yeah. And, the thing is that as polarized as our society is right now, we need everything working in our favor that we can have that will give people confidence, right? So that means that, like, the most fundamental blocking and tackling in the system have to do that well, right? People have to feel confident, kind of like flying a plane, right? You want to know that the plane is being flown properly. How much more something that really is going to affect our lives, like a national election.
Dr. Andrew Walker, so you have been up later than usual at night trying to figure out the meaning of these things. So take a stab at it. You're up to bat.
Yeah, sure. So, I think obviously there was a media expectations game that perhaps I'll own that I might have gotten duped a little bit, thinking that this was going to be a little bit bigger of a wave than what really actually transpired. But what I'm kind of thinking about right now in the aftermath of this is, when you consider the state of the economy, when you look at things like gas prices, when you look at kind of the explosive division that's happening in public schools, and that those kind of realities didn't really move the needle that drastically, it sends the signal to me that Americans are pretty entrenched in their viewpoints. And I think that kind of picks up on some themes that we've been writing about at World Opinions, about we're kind of living increasingly in a polarized America, in two Americas. And I think the fact that in typical election years, these dinner table type topics like the economy, it didn't really flip the election in one way, which means that there are kind of pre-commitments that individuals have to their parties ideologically that is not going to drive them out of that party. It raises the question to me of whether there really is that persuadable middle left very much in America at this point.
Yeah, that's a very good point, but there has to be a middle to some degree, because if you start with something like 40 to 43-4% for both parties, I mean, these elections are so close that obviously turnout's one factor, but I mean, you do have some really interesting data coming in about the suburbs, and the fact that you really are looking at suburban precincts where you have two phenomena, and one of them is, election by election on a 2-year pattern, they do swing back and forth somewhat. Now, there aren't that many, but they tend to have a lot of people and be very strategically located in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, Pennsylvania. The other interesting thing is that as you look at this, people really did this time split tickets. And for instance, the undervote for Herschel Walker in the Senate race in Georgia compared to the vote for Brian Kemp for governor, that's a pretty significant undercount at this point. And so that tells us something, right?
Yeah, I think it does. I think, I will fully own the fact that I'm not a statistician or know the demographics super well. But it seems to me that even if we account for kind of that undertow in the election, I would still argue that the share of kind of that middle block is arguably perhaps shortening in America because, I mean, really, you talk about this all the time. The party's platforms are, from 1960 to today, they're completely different planets. They're different moral universes. And so I think what we're seeing right now is we're living in an America where even if you're moderately paying attention to the party's platforms, they're so stark and often irreconcilable that you're going to have to choose which party you're going to be with. And you're not probably going to be there by accident.
Yeah, Andrew, to make your point, one of the things we notice is that there is a shrinking middle, no doubt about it. It has been for a long time, because the polarization in this country means that if you're a serious voter, you pretty well know what kind of serious voter you are. But what's really interesting is that in that swing, whatever it is, let's just say for sake of conversation, it's between 5 and 8%. There seem to be two things that drive a lot of the attention, and one of them is, do I like the way things are going? And then the second thing is, do I like this guy or do I like this person, man or woman? And I'll just say that's not a particularly informed vote either way.
No, I think that's completely correct. And I think that we're also seeing the fact that the rise of some of these kind of personality candidates, that it's drawing people into not so much an issue of substance that we would hope it would be, but it's more kind of tribal shibboleths, tribal identification, who represents you and your party that you think is most representing you, and they're there for your behalf, so to speak.
Allie Beth, the election on Tuesday was for me devastating because of the unmitigated disaster it represented for the cause of the sanctity of human life. We had 3 states, Michigan, California, and Vermont, passed constitutional amendments that are so radical. It's just, it is not fair to suggest that they just codified Roe v. Wade, especially in the state of Vermont. You're talking about a right of so-called reproductive freedom that apparently has no boundary whatsoever. And in Michigan and California, close to being the same. Here in Kentucky, and then also in Montana, but I'll say very close to home here in Kentucky, we devastatingly lost a simple constitutional amendment that simply would have stated that there is no right to abortion in the Kentucky Constitution. So you care so deeply about these issues. What does Tuesday mean?
Yes, and in Montana, you talked about the Kentucky amendment being clear. The Montana measure was not as clear, but still extremely disturbing. This was a measure that simply would have guaranteed caring for children who survived abortion. So we don't even have the euphemism of bodily autonomy or my body, my choice anymore. And that, I mean, they literally voted for taking away medical care from children outside of the womb. But like you said, in Kentucky, very simple amendment. It could have passed. And I don't like to simply blame it on the abortion lobby. The fact is, there are hundreds of millions of dollars in the behemoth that is the abortion activist lobby that works against these kinds of measures, spreading all kinds of misinformation. And what I found among Christian women, even those who would identify as pro-life, or this term that we've heard increasingly over the past couple of years, holistically pro-life, they were really taken in by a lot of the narratives that said any restriction on abortion will restrict a woman from receiving care for miscarriages or receiving care for ectopic pregnancies. I and many other people tried so hard to show them the legislation, to show that that's simply not the case when it comes to the laws that are on the books. And yet a lot of people, in the name of empathy, in the name of what I would think is misplaced or misunderstood compassion, have believed this, that it's actually not compassionate to be for these pro-life measures. I don't know if that was the decisive factor when it comes to Kentucky, but that is what I am seeing even among Christian women who call themselves pro-life. And it's really a shame. I'm not sure what else we can do besides just tell them the truth.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the place to start. And I think some confrontation is going to be called for in terms of especially those who identify as evangelical Christians and yet have so utterly failed in translating the sanctity of human life into electoral choices. You know, years ago, but not that long ago, in the state of Mississippi, arguably the most pro-life state in the union, they turned down a personhood amendment just because they got scared of it. The other side scared voters away from the personhood amendment by saying this will happen and that will happen. In Kentucky, the very same thing. And we're talking about almost $10 million of outside money. I agree with you. You cannot blame the pro-abortion movement for being pro-abortion. That's who they are. I blame the voters of Kentucky who have indicated by other means. And by the way, they gave percentages of about 80% in both houses of the Kentucky General Assembly. And that's a pro-life vote. But they didn't translate it in that amendment where it matters. And Allie Beth, I think a part of it is evangelicals are scared by arguments that this policy will lead to hard cases. What do we do with that?
Yes, and you happen to talk about this today on your show. And so I agree with your reasoning there that anything that has to do with morality, any law that represents righteousness is going to present difficulty. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we have judges. They are supposed to judge these difficult cases. It's almost as if, and we kind of saw this same thing over the past couple of years with a lot of the restrictions that were put in place, people looking for something that has no debate or no discussion or no difficulty or no nuance whatsoever. And that's just not what happens. But of course, as pro-lifers, we care about the sanctity of the mother's life and the child's life. But what we're looking at here is the physical life of the child versus the choice or maybe the well-being, intangible or not, of the mother. And when you pit those two things against each other, of course, the right to life should win out every time.
That's right.
For some reason, I do think that that is really difficult for a lot of Christians who, with good, probably compassionate intentions, to remember, because the personhood of the child is so often in every conversation just completely ignored. I even find a lot of people who identify, in the realm of pro-life as just forgetting what abortion is, what the procedure actually looks like.
Allie Beth, thank you. I want to turn to Erick. Let me ask you a political question. How in the world can we translate pro-life votes when it comes to candidates into pro-life votes when it comes to policy?
The carrot and the stick approach is one way to do it. If you also have to give a little room for compromise. So, for example, in Georgia, they passed the 6-week fetal heart ban before the 2020 election. And the most contested state legislative race in the entire country was Ed Setzler in Cobb County, Georgia, part of the state that had shifted dramatically to the Democrats. His district had been won by Stacey Abrams and won by Hillary Clinton. He was a Republican, knocked door to door, did grassroots, talked to the black voters who were becoming a majority of his district, and he won despite more money spent against him than any other state legislator in the entire nation. He got reelected after passing that. That sent a big signal. At the same time, there were members of the pro-life community in Georgia attacking the fetal heartbeat legislation and any Republican who dared to support it because they didn't think it went far enough. The Republicans were able to push it through, though, and suffered no penalty. In fact, I was looking at the exit poll in Georgia. Brian Kemp won overwhelmingly the voters who decided they either wanted limits on abortion or absolute prohibitions. He got 40% of those who wanted restrictions. But interestingly enough, how did the voters of Georgia view the Dobbs decision? 75% supported the Dobbs decision.
Wow.
The pro-life community, I think, so long focused on just let us have the conversation by getting Roe v. Wade. We never spent time on how to have the conversation once Roe v. Wade was gone. I think we now have to try to figure that out, and it's going to be regionally different. One interesting side point on this, New York State, which has very aggressive pro-abortion legislation, saw Republicans picking up deep blue centers of New York because women voters didn't feel threatened their abortion rights would go away. We, the pro-life community, need to make sure Republicans don't look at that and become tempted to enshrine further abortion legislation nationally in order to pick up seats in legislatures.
Yeah, Andrew Walker, you have worked on this issue for so long and so passionately. So Erick says we have one thing, we've got to make the case and make it legislatively. So make it. Just make the case for us. How do we make the case in a way that will catch the conscience and translate into votes among evangelical Christians?
Sure. I mean, one of the ways I frame this up whenever I'm teaching on this or giving a speech on this is to remember that Christians in this discussion are the ones that are seeking to expand the canopy of human dignity, and it's pro-choice individuals who are seeking to restrict the canopy of human dignity. And in the full sweep of human history, I think history judges those well who are seen defending the rights of those who are marginalized, oppressed, who are voiceless. And so I think this actually gives us a powerful rhetorical tool for us to understand that this is, yes, Christian in the sense that we believe that every human being is made in God's image and therefore has profound inherent worth and dignity. But this is also a profoundly American way to argue as well. The fact that when we think about the Declaration of Independence, that we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, to distinguish why those rights apply inside the womb or outside the womb, but not inside the womb, that requires some, I think, illogical steps that I think we need to be willing to call individuals to account for, to do it in a loving, passionate, sympathetic type way, but to understand that the whole project of the American experiment, I think, is one where we're able to continually self-perfect and self-reform our nation.
Yeah,
I feel like this issue in particular is one where we are on that long march to really be consistent with our creed. That is the Declaration of Independence. And so I think this is why we should be encouraged and heartened. It means we have to keep making the arguments. I echo what Erick said. My fear is right now that because of the setbacks that happened on Tuesday, that this is going to lead a lot of individuals to want to kind of just run in the opposite direction. And my plea to those types of individuals would be to understand that this is never less than a Christian issue. So go to Psalm 139, absolutely. But to understand that this is fundamentally an American issue, and we should see ourselves carrying the mantle and carrying the tradition of what it has meant to be America at its best.
And this is a fixable issue, Andrew. In other words, this issue is not beyond political correction. I think that's a very important point. This is a moral battle, but there's a political responsibility, and there still is a political opportunity.
No, certainly. I mean, so right now we can look at what happened on Tuesday, and put ourselves back in January of 1973. It seems dispiriting. It seems like we're at a low point again in terms of the American conversation around this. Okay, well, things were bad in 1973. Things aren't great right now based on what happened on Tuesday, but it means that from Tuesday's results, it simply means more work. And so the work that began in 1973 in terms of coalitions, policy work, academics, activists, those doing the hard work of grassroots mobilization, it means we have to do more of that right now. And I think if anything, what's encouraging, we actually have an infrastructure right now in place across 50 states for this conversation to continue. We just can't turn backwards to this conversation because we suffered a defeat on Tuesday.
Right. Hunter Baker, you teach political science, and your students flock to your classes because they want to hear what you have to say about not only the theory of state, but about our understanding of what's going on right now. So let me ask you a right now question as a political scientist. World Magazine back in October reported that that former President Trump's coattails politically were not as long as they appeared to be. And, so as you're looking at this, you recognize that that politics is a matter of policy and of person. So as a political scientist, we'll track this out a little bit more, but just let me ask you, how does that factor in here, the person and the policy? Because it appeared that you had voters in places like Georgia or Pennsylvania, and I'll center on Pennsylvania, who said, look, these are the policies we want, but we don't want this person. Help us with that.
Yeah, I think that Donald Trump has had effects in different directions, right? On the one hand, I mean, Eric has already mentioned this. We're seeing improvements with regard to the voting patterns of people in demographics that usually just don't vote Republican or vote Republican less often, right? So, for example, the numbers of Hispanics seems to be up. I was reading a column from Rui Teixeira, who used to say that, you know, the non-white voters would swamp the white voters and there would be a permanent Democratic majority because of that. And he's repudiated that now because of the different direction that we've seen some of these voters go. And so Donald Trump has clearly made a difference there somewhere through maybe his own celebrity, through the mix of policies that he has put forward. But the other thing is that he also seems to repel. So, for example, one group, and this relates to the previous question, one group that the Democrats have been really trying to activate, especially since about 2012, is the unmarried female voter.
Right.
In fact, a lot of people felt that the Health and Human Services mandate, you know, the famous Hobby Lobby case, and many of our institutions dealt with this challenge of being forced to purchase contraceptive and abortifacient products. A lot of people thought that policy was explicitly designed to get single female voters to the polls. You know, so they're sympathetic to the Democratic Party, but they were not great about getting out to the polls. I think that a combination of Dobbs and the person of Donald Trump motivated unmarried female voters to come to the polls, and probably in large numbers. We talked about why didn't we get a wave? Well, part of the reason you don't get a wave is that the wave is blunted by unmarried female voters.
Yeah. So, Hunter, let me ask you a question straightforwardly. So, using the categories of overvote and undervote, where an overvote means that a candidate gets votes he or she doesn't really deserve, you know, carried by someone else. And an undervote is where, in this case, this context, people don't get votes they should have deserved because of their policy. So, for instance, you look at the Senate race in Pennsylvania, a lot closer than the governor's race. And so you look at that, and let me ask you, what are the lessons about that undervote? In other words, it really was a repudiation of a certain kind of candidate that we see. I mean, not uniform, but nonetheless, there's a pretty good pattern of a certain kind of candidate that that voters didn't want.
Yeah, well, so we've seen a lot about the Democrats had a strategy of funding some of these candidates who were maybe we identify them as the MAGA candidate, right? Over against maybe the more typical Republican candidate. And Democrats made a bet that those would be better to face in the election than kind of the typical, person with R on their jersey. And it looks like that may have been a pretty good strategy that a lot of these candidates were not candidates of quality, and that hurt the Republicans in the midterms.
Allie Beth, a few years ago in the gubernatorial election in Virginia, it turned out that the most crucial distinction in voting, the most crucial contrast was between women who voted without children in the home and women who voted with children in the home. And the latter went overwhelmingly conservative and Republican. But on the other side, those without children in the home went overwhelmingly liberal and Democrat.
Yes.
You got an answer for why that's true?
Yes, I was thinking about this today, about why 63%, I think, of unmarried women, as we just heard, are voting Democrat versus a much lower percentage of married women. I think that there are a few reasons that you're probably more likely to be Christian or religious or have some kind of traditional worldview if you are getting married and not just going around to multiple partners or whatever it is. And then you're also more likely to have kids probably than the unmarried women. And having kids, the nature of marriage and the nature of motherhood changes your perspective on the world. You are no longer just thinking about yourself and your job. And that's not to say that unmarried women can't also be very selfless, but it forces you into a perspective of thinking not just how this policy affects me and my pocketbook, but how does it affect my children their safety, their well-being, their education, and also their children. I mean, your world, your perspective, your concerns, your hopes, your fears widen, expand so much when you get married, and then also when you become a mother. And I also think a lot of people don't want to say this, but look, a lot of women, married women, one of the reasons why they vote Republican in alignment and closer alignment with men, unmarried and married, is because they are influenced, and I think rightly and healthily so, by their husbands. Their husbands are talking to them about politics. And so they are probably getting their understanding of the world and politics more from conversations with their husband, whereas unmarried women are very often getting it from social media, only getting it from their friends. They're getting it from different sources. So there are many reasons, I think many good reasons, why a married woman tends to vote conservative versus an unmarried woman.
I'll be honest, Allie Beth, I'd not heard that last argument before. I think it's phenomenally insightful. I really appreciate that. Erick, I want to ask you a blunt question. The media is saying that the big winner of the 2022 midterm elections is Joe Biden, that the president of the United States. He wasn't on the ballot, but maybe he was. Was he?
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the voters, according to the exit polling, having adjusted now to the turnout, Americans do not like Joe Biden, do not want Joe Biden to run again, do not like the way he's handled the economy, do not like the way he's handled education policy in the country, do not like the way he's handled inflation, do not like anything he's done. And yet they preferred him and his party to the Republicans' best midterm showing of any president in his first term outside of George W. Bush in 2002. Because they were able more to make this about go with the people you know that you don't like than the people who seem crazier on the other side. It was a strategy very effectively pulled off by the Democrats with aid from a lot of Republicans. They helped get their Republican nomination. So I would say, yes, it was a very good night for the president. And in fact, he's gone from being someone that the media was already starting to do reports suggesting he was getting too old to be the leader of the Democratic Party to now the guy who's the front runner for the Democratic nomination in 2024 if he wants it.
Yeah, but did you hear his speech today to the staff of the Democratic National Committee? I mean, what do we do with that? I mean, who is that?
Well, the problem here is that the media, by and large, had started criticizing him, thinking this red wave was coming. They will pull that back now. And if you have Donald Trump announcing next week that he wants to be president of the United States, it is very clear this is the first election in the last 5 where independent voters broke for the Democratic Party. They have tended to go for the Republicans. It's a very easy get for the Republicans to get them back. But the fact that independent voters hate everything about the economy and the direction of the country and still wanted to go for Joe Biden really speaks volumes as to the Republicans have a problem with candidate quality.
Yeah, Andrew Walker, I know you keep up with what the president's saying, and the Joe Biden who showed up today to declare victory in Tuesday's elections made the most pro-abortion statements that I believe have ever been made by an American president. And just explain this, explain this, because this is the Joe Biden who for decades had supported the Hyde Amendment, who claimed to be, as a well-known, and I say this in his words, practicing Catholic, who at one point said that he was not pro-abortion, but he was making this separation between his personal position and piety and public policy on the other hand. But, today it was just like abortion is the greatest good, and we just saved it for America, and we're not going back. What do you do with that?
Well, I think we can understand that both policy is character and character is policy. And you have a president who has, for goodness, 4 decades of service, basically been on every imaginable plot line you could be on this particular issue. What this indicates is not actual conviction. It indicates political expedience, which is basically just politics for politics' sake. That's not moral leadership. That's not principled leadership. It's not moral leadership. It also doesn't indicate any type of leadership, I think, coming from a conviction, coherent, defined worldview necessarily. But I also think that this just is another one of these moments where we're having kind of the veil pulled back about the different moral universes that Americans are occupying. I use the term moral universes because it kind of signifies that we are kind of in these self-contained chambers that are impenetrable, irreconcilable, and have vastly different interpretations on the world. And I think the Christian worldview here is one of consistency and permanency here. And you juxtapose that with the pro-choice worldview, where, in the 1990s, it was safe, legal, and rare, to now in 2022, it's shout your abortion. The thing I'm concerned about as a Christian and as an ethics professor is, where do we go from here on this particular issue? Because we're no longer even trying to provide any type of stigma around this issue. And so, this isn't necessarily related to just American context, but recently in Canada, we had Canadian doctors before the Canadian Parliament advocating for euthanasia for children who are born up to 1 year of age. And so I'm just thinking, okay, so we're, a few years always behind, it feels like, with Canada. Where do we go now as far as our issues around human dignity, when we have one platform in the United States that is not trying to, hide a pro-abortion mindset?
Yeah, I mean, that's kindly said in terms of, the reality is that it's even more than that. Again, it was nothing but cheerleading for abortion today in the president's statement. Allie Beth, what do you say to people? And you hear this, and it's thrown at you as it's thrown at the rest of us. What do you say to the person who says, "Look, I'm an evangelical, but I can vote for either party, or I can vote on other grounds"? What do you say?
Yeah. So I hear that argument a lot from people who say, you know what, I am personally pro-life, but I don't think that I can impose my views on someone else. Or I believe these things about marriage, about gender, but at the end of the day, because of a misunderstanding of separation of church and state, a lot of people say, well, I'll vote Democrat. I don't want to be a single issue voter because these policies say that they help what they would call the least of these. I mean, we could spend 2 hours just talking about that line of reasoning, but something that I argue on my podcast, very simply, there are plenty of Bible verses that we could cite, but really all we have to do is go back to Genesis 1. We could go to Genesis 1:1. God created the heavens and the earth. That tells us who the authority is, who the definer is, who is the arbiter of truth, who is the giver of value. And then we can go to Genesis 1:27. Right there tells us really what Christians need to think, what we should think about abortion. Okay, God made us in his image. We're not just clumps of cells. What we should think about gender. God made us male and female in his image. What we should think about marriage. That's the creation of the family right there. And those issues, they may not have been on the ballot 50 years ago. They are on the ballot in one way or another in 2022. And I have to vote as a Christian in alignment with those values, because if God created those things, and I believe that he is love, 1 John 4:8, I believe that his ways are better, then I cannot love my neighbor by voting in a way that opposes God's order. That is not the same thing as forcing people to worship Christ. It is not a violation of the separation of church and state or the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment. It is simply doing what secular progressives do, by the way. They bring their worldview to the voting booth to shape curriculum, to shape laws, to shape culture. I am saying this is my worldview. I believe that God created the heavens and the earth. That means I cannot separate my politics from that. That determines what I think about policy and what I think about culture. And I have to vote in alignment with God's order if I love him, and also if I love other people.
No, so well said. And I think it's just really important that the reference of the points you made, and particularly when it comes to creation order, when it comes to the sanctity of human life, when it comes to the institution of marriage, also right there in Genesis chapter 1 and explicit in Genesis chapter 2 and affirmed by Jesus in Matthew 19. That's pre-political. And again, I think even some conservatives fail to understand that our first responsibility is to maintain what is prior to politics. We can disagree about tax policy. We can disagree about, issues of national security. But when it comes to what is pre-political, created by God,
Right.
we've got nowhere to go.
Yes, and that's why I'm always confused by Christians who say that they don't want to wade into the culture wars or they don't want to talk about abortion because it's so divisive and it's so political and they just want to love people. And typically they just kind of mean be nice to people. And as you just said, these issues for the Christian, abortion, gender, marriage, the family, while they do have political manifestations and consequences, for the Christian, they're pre-political, they're pre-civilizational. And
Right.
so for the Christian, they're not primarily political. They are primarily biblical. They are primarily Genesis 1 issues. They're
That's right.
primarily Genesis 1:1 issues. Who do you think created all of this?
Right.
If that is true, then that changes everything, including your politics.
So well said. Hunter, I really want to throw a big one at you. Almost all of the analysis leading up to the election and afterwards suggests that conservatives are absolutely doomed because younger Americans are so morally permissive, politically progressive. You spend your time teaching young people. So, and you're a political scientist. So as both a teacher and a political scientist, jump into this. Are we doomed by demographics?
No, I don't think we are. You can look back. I just referenced Rui Teixeira with kind of his conclusion that the non-white vote would always be a Democrat vote, and that would swamp the Republicans and consign them to oblivion. He has revised his own thesis, and I would say the same thing about young people. What we tend to see is that people are often more liberal when they're younger, right? We can all recall the famous Winston Churchill quote about, if you have a heart, you're a socialist when you're 18, and if you have a brain, you're a conservative at 50 or something like that. I think that as students grow up, as they have more responsibilities, as they're responsible for themselves, these things will alter their view of the world. I can remember so clearly, and I know that probably all of us can remember this, how I viewed my parents at 18 and how I viewed them 7 years later when I was 25 or when I was 30 or once I started having children. All of these developments in life affect the way you view the world, and that's going to happen to the millennials. It will happen to Gen Z. Now, I will tell you this, though. I do think that the enduring challenge that we have is going to be on marriage and sexuality.
Absolutely.
Because I note that even with my own children even have their kind of knowing glances at each other when I begin talking about, sex and marriage and human sexuality. Dad's getting all ramped up about that. I think that they think that I'm very intense about this and I'm very excited about this. And why is it such a big deal to me? And that's because this is the first group that literally the shows they've been watching on the Disney Channel, and things like that have promoted a particular view of sexuality.
No doubt about that. Let me just tell you some bad news though for your theory, but I hope you're right. We're all hoping and praying you're right. Let me tell you the counter evidence is this: in previous generations, there has been a rebound to church attendance once people reach the late 20s or the early 30s, and once they have children. That is not happening right now, and hasn't been happening for about 10 to 15 years. That means that something has changed. And I think what I would offer here is that I think in previous generational cycles, people pretty much knew their spiritual home or identity and returned to that. I think there's some evidence now that we have some, young people so alienated that there's no identity that way for them to return to.
Well, there's a lot of cost. Okay. So young people right now face tremendous disincentives to be faithful, right? So I can remember when we gathered to sign the Nashville statement, I didn't feel great at age, 48 or whatever I was at the time, thinking, wow, okay, this is the decisive step from which one cannot walk back.
Right.
And so young people all face that, right? They all will be concerned with being marginalized and being hated by the culture at large, and they can see where things are going. But my rejoinder to kind of the evidence that you're marshaling is that childhood has gotten a lot longer. Growing up is taking a lot longer. The number of kids who are not driving at 16, maybe they're driving at 20, maybe they're driving at 22. I mean, everything is stretching out. And the other thing is that everybody has to ultimately deal with that question of what becomes of me once I die, right? And I think that, you start getting around the age of 50 or whatever, that becomes more compelling. And I think that we're going to have another one of these waves. I remember when the baby boomers began to kind of become interested in religion again, the late 1970s, we go from God is dead to this sudden, where are all these religious people coming from? I think that may happen again.
All right. We've got time now. I just want to turn to every one of you for a concise argument about where we go from here. I think Christians want to know, okay, you've given us something in the landscape. There's still questions to be answered from this election, but just jumping ahead, imagine we're having this conversation, and let's just say we hope and pray everything's settled by January, but let's just say we're having a conversation in January of 2023. Where do we go from here? I just want to go around. Eric, so where do we go from here?
I think we have to go back to truth, and this goes to something you and Allie Beth were talking about. We believe in a worldview that suggests we should vote in a certain way, but that way also suggests we have to be committed to the truth. And we've had a lot of candidates on the Republican side who have been peddling their own mythologies and revisions of history to have to get around unpleasant truths. We need a recommitment to actual truth so that people can rely on us and relate to us. At the same time, I think as Christians, we need to realize that God tells us to seek the welfare of the city in which we live, which actually means that local geographic region, and not be so worked up about Washington, D.C. all the time. Your local county commission, your local school board is going to affect your life on a daily basis far more than Washington. And that fact that Christians are starting to engage at that level in school board races and the like really does long-term change the country.
Okay. That is that's a place to start. Andrew Walker.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things I tell my students, and I'm teaching a political theology class right now, is we can have all of the intellectual arguments, we can write the books, we can give the speeches. But when it comes to what politics is a 50+1 game. And so while politics isn't everything in the Christian worldview, and we don't want to collapse all of our hope into politics,
Certainly.
Politics does matter. As Eric just said, politics is about, I think, using and channeling power for the sake of the good, the common good, seeking justice with it. So I think that means when we look at kind of setbacks from Tuesday regarding the life issue, it means every single Christian is going to be having to think about, okay, in 2 years, if there are ballot initiatives, what do I need to do in 2024 that I didn't do in 2022? I also think it means, and I don't mean to get political or favoring one candidate in this conversation, but I think it means we need to be looking for candidates who are willing to stand on conviction, willing to pay a price for that conviction, willing to do so in a calm, reasoned manner. And I think that, courage actually does get rewarded. Yeah. And I think that there are models today of candidates who have actually shown themselves to be quite effective at an electoral level when they are daring to be courageous. And I think that's actually one of the things that we are most in need of in this moment.
Yeah, Allie Beth, again, I want to pose the question to you. What are you saying to your listeners about where we go from here?
Yes, so just on the political level, I think that if you are a governor, if you are a representative, then you do need to look at the model of Ron DeSantis. He was willing to be the first one to say and do things that other Republicans just weren't willing to do. I mean, his parental rights and education bill that was then dubbed the Don't Say Gay bill, he went against the LGBTQ lobby. There are very few Republicans willing to do that, even if it was just legislation that covered kindergarten through third grade. I mean, they blew it up and turned it into something else. He knew that was going to happen, and he pressed forward anyway, and he turned blue districts red by waging the culture war in a way that I think a lot of other Republicans are scared of, without constantly having to make his constituents and supporters apologize for different embarrassing tweets that he tweeted or things that he said that we have had to do with other candidates who have been culture warriors. And so I think look to the state of Florida, look to how Ron DeSantis has led. And then I think on the local level, there is so much ground to gain. There are a lot of problems in our education system. I think running for school board, for city council, I think that's a great ground game to play. And then just really quickly on just the personal spiritual side of things, I know a lot of people, particularly in Michigan, are really demoralized. A lot of pro-life Christians are just sad about Whitmer, about the proposal going through. And I would just say, look, as Elizabeth Elliot always said, the only thing that you have to do today is the will of God. That's the only thing that you have to do. And if you don't know what that is, do the next right thing in faith with excellence and for the glory of God. There are political implications to that. There are also personal implications to that. Doing your job, whether it's as a mom or whether it is a career, whatever it is, doing that with joy and for the glory of God is enough. We saw through 49 years of unsung and unseen obedience by Christians that God can use those small acts of obedience in really big ways, as we saw with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So there's a lot of hope for a lot of reasons.
That's fantastic. All right, Hunter.
Yeah.
Closing word. Where do we go from here?
I want to double down on the life issue. You look at Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal, and Brown v. Board of Education. There's about a half century. You look at Roe v. Wade and you look at Dobbs. There's about a half century. After Brown v. Board of Education, about a dozen years later, you get the Civil Rights Act of 1964, changes everything. And then over time changes more hearts and minds. I think that we absolutely have to have that same kind of determination and drive as the civil rights pioneers did. I think that we have to have that same level of conviction. When somebody says, don't impose your preferences, I say, would you have said that when they were battling against segregation or something? This issue is every bit as morally and spiritually compelling. And the last thing I want to say is, so I know there's skepticism about other things. I have a lot of confidence in the gospel. I just think about, I went to Florida State University at age 18. I was as lost as a goose, Dr. Mohler. And the gospel and the resurrection of Jesus Christ hit me like a juggernaut. And that can happen to young people today too.
Yes.
Well, I had no idea that we'd reach this point. Talk about a lost goose. But nonetheless, what a great testimony to the power of the gospel. And we are Christians. And so we do not end with any earthly confidence. We have an earthly responsibility and stewardship. But our trust is in Christ, and that's how I can sleep at night. That's how we can get through the day. But we want to think as Christians as well. This is the great joy of working with the team at World Opinions. We get to think about these things and write about these things, and hopefully to serve the cause of Christ and the world family with these essays, articles, and opinions. And we pray that they will all be brought captive to the Word of God. And that's our commitment. We want to thank you for joining with us tonight. What a fantastic opportunity I've had and for you to be a part of in listening to these contributors all speak from their minds and hearts. This is the great joy, again, of World Opinions. We appreciate your interest, not only in this conversation, but in the great project of trying to help Christians to think as Christians. So what a great conversation tonight. We've come to the end of our time. And I just want to thank the panelists, Andrew Walker, Allie Beth Stuckey, Erick Erickson, and Hunter Baker. We just appreciate everything every one of you brought to this conversation. And I can tell you the only regret I have is that we can't keep doing this all night. But all good things must come to an end. And as we conclude, I simply want to say thanks as well to our sponsor, Preborn. God bless you all, and good night.
And I just was so overwhelmed. I had individuals around me not wanting me to have this child. I didn't feel like I had it.